cruise. This was more of an expedition, of an adventure, and it was quite different to any other cruise. So do you kind of get what we were saying then? If it's your first time down, it's not like any other cruise, is it? Going to the Antarctic, it's a privilege. You need to cross that Drake Passage, you need to get down there and then all the way back. So I mean, to me, it's been quite a remarkable cruise. We've had fantastic weather. We've had some really good bits of the cruise when we're in the bays and the weather's calmed down and it's very calm. To me, it feels like we've seen different sides to the Antarctic. So we've seen the very kind of angry seas and the high winds. We've seen the wildlife. We've seen some history. So for me personally, I think we've had a fantastic cruise. I think we've been really lucky. So big round of applause to the Antarctic, fantastic. And yeah, I think we get this idea that it isn't an ordinary cruise. This is something quite different, and you feel a sense of achievement. And we've kind of all done it together. So we've had the most wonderful captain and the officers up on the bridge. So big round of applause to them. They've done an incredible job to get us all down there, all back again. We've seen some of the smaller ships, and we've kind of felt, a little bit like poor old passengers on that ship. We shouldn't say it, but we do feel a little bit smug that we can cruise down there across the Drake Passage. When we want to, we can come back in. We have all the fantastic food, the hot chocolate. Boy, I think that hot chocolate kept me going throughout the voyage, definitely. I had a little bit too much, I think. But the pizza slice, whatever you want, we have here. Plus, we get to experience the real Antarctic. We go to the same places that all of the ships go. We see the same things. There's always the unexpected as well. So before we start talking about the whales and the dolphins, this map is a little bit confusing. There's a little bit too much going on. But if you can see the South Shetland Islands up here, so this is King George Island, Admiralty Bay, where we spent a long time inside Admiralty Bay. We had the glaciers, we had the Polish station, Artowski station, the Brazilian, the Commandant Ferraz station. We got to see the scientists in the stations. We waved to them outside, some of us did. The glaciers, so this is King George Island and Admiralty Bay, and then Elephant Island, where we made a little pilgrimage to Ernest Shackleton. But if you remember, we hit the pack ice and the tabular icebergs. Now, that was unusual. We don't get that often. That was unusual. What we have down here is an area of all year round pack ice. So this sea ice down here never melts. And this is the Weddell Sea. This channel, the Antarctic Sound, is often called Iceberg Alley. And in the past, maybe 20 years or so, we regularly would go down Antarctic Sound. This is always full of big tabular icebergs and pack ice, bergy bits and growlers. And sometimes, if there's been a major calving event down here in the Weddell Sea, so if some of these ice shells have calved, there was a large iceberg called A81 that came off down here. So if there's been a lot of ice down here, sometimes we find that it gets blown up here, and it gets blown a little bit further west than it usually would do. So usually the ice comes up here and then goes up towards South Georgia, but sometimes it gets blown further west, and that was what we saw. So we saw it's quite unusual to see so much winter pack ice and the big tabular icebergs all the way around up here, around King George Island and up past Elephant Island, all around here. So we were lucky to see that, to get that glimpse of the winter pack ice and the big tabular icebergs. So that was kind of unusual to see that, but that was lucky for us. Probably not so lucky for the officers up on the bridge and the captain that had to deal with it all, but they did a wonderful job. And we saw some of these huge tabular icebergs, the brash ice, the bergy pits, all the way up by King George Island yesterday. So that was pretty exciting to see that, and the wonderful light, wonderful colours that we had from that whole experience. And then yesterday, it seems a longer, but only yesterday morning, quite early, we arrived at Elephant Island. And as I mentioned, that was our kind of pilgrimage to the great Antarctic hero, to Ernest Shackleton and his ship, the Endurance. So they lost their ship through the pack ice in the Weddell Sea, and they managed to reach Elephant Island. And as you saw, it's probably the most inhospitable place. So it's never been inhabited. It's glaciers, a few little rocky beaches. We're here in summer, believe it or not. We're here in midsummer, but they were there at the beginning of the winter. And they turned over 2 of the tiny little lifeboats, and they made huts on the beach. And so 22 men were left behind on Elephant Island from April right the way through to the end of August, and they lived there, hardly any food, and they had a few sledging rations left over. They ate the limpets, the little shells on the beach, to make some soup. They used the layer of fat from the seals and the penguins to make fire, so they used that as fuel on the beach. And every day they would pack up their things and they would say, come on, the boss is going to come and rescue us today. And Ernest Shackleton, Worsley, Crean and 3 of us had sailed off on a tiny lifeboat 800 miles to South Georgia. And they believed that he would come and rescue them, so they had the optimism that he would come back, and he did. The very last day of August, came back on a tiny little tugboat from Punta Arenas and rescued the men on the beach. So we were really lucky to get so close into the beach to actually see the location where the boats were from that wonderful, wonderful, probably the best adventure story of all time. So if you haven't read the book, definitely when you get home, get one of the Shackleton books and read up on this story. So that was yesterday. But then back to today's talk. I thought we'd have a little bit of a look back at the whales that we've seen during the cruise. So we're kind of looking back a little bit, but we are at the beginning of the next phase of our voyage, and there will still be whales and dolphins around. There'll be a migratory route down the side of South America, so we'll be looking for the southern right whales. The Falkland Islands is a big place for whales and dolphins, so we've still got a lot to look forward to, but we'll mainly look at the ones that we've seen in the Southern Ocean so far. So these are old friends, the humpbacks. Then we've got the blue whales. Anybody see a blue whale? Anybody? I mean, you'd be really lucky to see a blue whale, but they are coming back. They are around. The fin whales, you can see the little sort of half-moon shaped fin on their backs, the very long backs. And then the orcas, the killer whales. So they come to there are some of the key species that we've been looking for. This is what we want to see, isn't it? This is what you're always hoping to see. You're always hoping to see that whale breaching so you can see the whole creature coming out of water. Unfortunately, this is what most of us see most of the time. So you're kind of hoping so much, and then you just see this little back coming out and a little tail. But it's still fantastic. You can't describe that feeling when you're out there on deck and you can see the whale. You know, I think when we were around Port Lockroy, we were quite close to some humpbacks, and we'd stopped. The engines were quiet, and we had thank you very much. Had the humpback whales. Humpback whales fairly close to the ship there, so I hope you got some good views, even if it is just the tail and the little back of the whale. So we see the humpback. That's where the whale gets its name from. This is the biggest muscle in the animal kingdom. This is the huge, powerful muscle that allows the humpback whale to dive deep down. So that's why they're called the humpbacks. And then the fin up here, the funny little shaped dorsal fin that comes up, the little curved dorsal fin, and you see them diving down, usually to feed. Often this is the first thing we see. So very often we just see the spray of the whale, and when we're out at sea, this is what you'll be looking out for. And this is when the whale exhales. So they've dived down deeply. They're mammals, the same as us. so they have to breathe the air. So they'll take a big breath, dive down. When they come back up to the surface again, the warm air that's been inside their body, it's like kind of a higher pressure, comes out into the low pressure air, into the colder air, and it condenses. So we get this big spray as they come up. And if you're close enough to them, you can hear them, which is a wonderful sound to hear the whales blowing. Now, the different whales have got different shaped sprays. So that's kind of really considerate of them, because we can spot what they are from a distance. The humpback's got a kind of a bushy blow. The grey whale actually has a heart-shaped blow. So if you're looking for grey whales, they make this beautiful heart-shaped blow, and you'll know that they're the grey whales. The blue whales and the fin whales, a very tall blow that just hangs in the air for a long time. So if you're out on deck and you see a blow that's straight up and tall and just seems to hang there for maybe 5 minutes, then that's likely to be a fin whale or a blue whale. And I like this one because you can see right down their nostrils. Look at that. It's not often you get to see down a whale's nostril, but these are their nostrils. Over the millions of years of evolution, they've migrated to the tops of the heads so they can blow out the water and breathe in on the tops of their heads. And the whales have got more efficient lungs than any other mammals, so they can store oxygen in their muscles. For us, we could stay underwater for about 3 minutes, would be our maximum. For the whales, they can dive down to depths of about 10,000 feet. They could stay underwater for about 2 hours, which is incredible. The whales have got a higher number of red blood cells, so they can absorb more oxygen. When they take a breath, they can absorb more oxygen into their bodies. We've got hemoglobin in their blood. They have something called myoglobin in their blood, so they can trap the oxygen. So every time they take in their breath, they can store more of that oxygen in their bodies. For us, when we dive, if we come up too quickly, we get something called the bends, when we get bubbles of nitrogen, and that can be fatal. But for the whales, they actually collapse their lungs, their rib cages, everything collapses down, and there's no space for those bubbles of nitrogen. So they can dive down quickly, they can come up quickly, and they're not troubled by the same problems that we would have if we could do that. So they've kind of evolved over millions of years to be able to live happily underwater, diving right down to the midnight zone, right down to the depths, to feed way down there. So here we are, back to our humpback whale. We look for the spray, we look for the little humpback, we look for the tail as it goes up. So if you see a whale out there, if you wait and you see the big tail or the flukes come up, then you'll know that is most likely to be a humpback whale. And they're feeding on the shoals of fish, on plankton. The humpbacks, they're not the biggest, the most streamlined of the whales. They're a little bit chunky, but I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think that's okay to be a little bit chubby. But they're not the fastest of the whales, but they are the most acrobatic, so they're probably the most interesting to watch. They'll often be breaching or fin slapping or tail slapping. On average, they grow to about 15 metres long, so it's about 40 tonnes. The females are slightly larger than the males, and that's the same in all the baleen whales. And this is a picture of the fluke of the tail. It's kind of like a fingerprint. So each whale has a unique tail, a fingerprint. And this is one of the ways that we are learning more and more about the whale's behaviour. And as the whale numbers are increasing, we can identify the individual whales, find out where they go, what they do, and how they behave. And you can see that each whale here, each of the flukes are different. So if you manage to get a photo of one of these flukes while we're in the Antarctic, or where you live, or where you're on holiday, anywhere, if you can get a good photo of the tail flukes, then you are able to identify them. You can see that whales, the humpbacks especially, often have scratches and scars on them. They have lots of encounters with the orca. So the orca will be hunting the humpback calves, the babies, and they will try to protect the babies from the orcas. So quite often you'll see the humpbacks will have scars on them, and sometimes also if they've been entangled with fishing nets, you'll see the evidence. But the flukes have a different pattern on them. And if you manage to get a good enough photo, so if you've got a good enough camera and a lens, then we talked about this at the beginning of the cruise. This is the Happy Whale website, and this is something that IATO, who are the cruise ship organisation down in the Antarctic, try to encourage people to get involved in this citizen science and send off your photo of the tails and try to identify what whale you've seen, and then that all gets fed into our understanding of these incredible creatures. So that's the Happy Whale website, and that's how we could identify what we see. Now, we don't usually see the whole of the humpback. This is the Latin name, the Magitera nova anglosi. So that's his Latin name, and it means, translated, it means the big winged New Englander. So they were first identified and named in New England. And this is the big wing, the pectoral fin that comes down. It's about 15 feet long on kind of average. It's about a third of the length of the humpback whale. And here we see this humpback is putting his big pectoral fin up in the air, and sometimes, did anybody see them slapping their fins when we were down there? A few people did. This is a behaviour that you see the humpbacks doing fairly often, and we're still trying to work out what some of this behaviour means. It could just be a simple thing of stunning the fish. So as they're feeding, if they keep slapping their fin on the surface of the water, then they're going to disorientate the fish that they're feeding on. So it's probably, there could be a simple, practical reason for it. But you often see the mums and the babies and the mothers do a lot of this fin slapping, especially when the babies or the young whales are being a little bit naughty, a little bit over-energetic, they're breaching a lot or being a bit wild. You see the mother whales kind of flapping the pectoral fin, and so we think that's the mum saying, okay, stop that, that's enough now. So there's a definite communication between the mother and the baby whales with this fin slapping, and also communication between the whales as well. So remember, these are very intelligent creatures, they're very social creatures, and they have quite a complex language, and we're only just beginning to kind of understand what some of this means. And another thing is the tail slapping. So anybody see this when we're down there? If you saw one of these humpback whales slapping the tail on the surface of the water over and over again. And as I said, with the fin slapping tends to be, okay, stop that, calm down, that's enough kind of thing for a mother and a baby. When the mums do this, it's a far more of, right, I have had enough. That's enough. And you think you would not argue with a mum that size. So this is slightly more of an assertive no. And it also comes between the whales as well. So there's a lot that we don't understand yet. But as the whale numbers are coming back, the fin slapping, the tail slapping, there's a lot of communication going on between these animals in their social group as they're communicating. Also, the very practical thing of stunning the fish. If they're feeding, you slap a tail that size down on the water, and the big shoal of fish are going to get confused, and it's easier to feed on them. So there's probably a combination of the two things going on here, but you may have seen that behaviour. And then the breaching is what we always want to see. We often don't see it, unfortunately. That's when we see the whole creature out of the water. And in many ways, this is still a bit of a mystery. We still don't quite understand why they're doing this. If you've been lucky enough to watch them, you might see a whale breaching over and over again. Sometimes if they've been feeding a lot, they'll be breaching afterwards. So we still don't really understand what all this is about. But we do know with the young whales, with the babies, that the more they breach, the more their myoglobin levels go up in their blood. So the more they can absorb the oxygen and the better they get at diving. So the breaching has got something to do with the physiology of the whale, of increasing how well they can dive and how long they can dive and how deep they can dive. Also, we always thought it could be that whales get terrible parasites. They get lice. Great big, which is horrible. You don't like to think of that, but they do have parasites on them. And doing something like this could be a way of removing an itch or a parasite. There's a possibility that we thought for a long time. Again, it could be to do with stunning or confusing the fish that they're feeding on, which seems quite a practical thing. We don't really know just yet. This is kind of research that's still going on, but it's most likely it could be communication. It could just be to increase the levels of myoglobin in the blood so that they can dive. So whales of all ages tend to do this. The young whales tend to do it more. The young males tend to do it kind of possibly more than any of the others. So that's something that we're still trying to understand about why they do this breaching out of the water. So things that we do know about the whales then, rather than keep talking about the stuff that we don't know. Things we do know, we know that they are baleen whales, and these are the baleen plates. So there's a compound in the body, a chemical in the body called keratin, which makes up our fingernails and our hair. And in the whales' teeth, as they're mammals, went back into the ocean. The enamel from the teeth disappeared over the years of evolution, and it was replaced with the same stuff that makes up our fingernails and our hair. So this is made out of keratin. So it's kind of a flexible material, and they hang down inside the mouth of the whale, and they make big kind of filters. So it's like a big sieve made out of keratin inside the whale's mouth, and they use them for filtering out the tiny food. So these are the biggest creatures on our planet, and they eat some of the smallest creatures on the planet, and they do that by filtering them out through these little plates of baleen. And a colleague that I worked with for many, many years, who was a whale biologist, he spent a lot of time with whales in New Zealand, setting up whale watching places, and he always said that the whales were more like cows. This is what he always said, because they're big grazing creatures. They like to come up to the boats and kind of be scratched on their heads. They're quite placid, they're inquisitive. So these are like the big grazing mammals in the sea that are feeding on the big shoals of plankton and the big shoals of small fish. And this is one of the things they're feeding on, these krill. As I said before, that's not real, that's not life size, so don't worry. They're tiny little things, about half an inch. And why do they come to the Antarctic to feed? In the spring, when the sun comes back, the cold water has got lots of oxygen in it, there's lots of nutrients in the Southern Ocean and around Antarctica. As the sea ice melts, all the algae that forms on the sea ice is released into the water, and we get a huge growth of this phytoplankton. So that is small, floating microorganisms that use the sun to photosynthesize, and that is like the start of life. That green algae, that's the start of the food chain, and that supplies the food for all the other small floating creatures, the zooplankton that feeds on the phytoplankton. And then the zooplankton, again, that's kind of the start of the food chain for all the other fish and all the other creatures. So this is why the whales come down to the Antarctic. It is like a huge 24-hour buffet of food down here. And here they are feeding. So this is bubble net feeding, when they'll blow the big net of bubbles around a shoal of fish or around the krill. And you can see the humpback whale taking a huge gulp of seawater, including all the krill and all the fish. Their tongue weighs about 2 tons. That's the size of like 2 cars, a huge 2-ton tongue. And that tongue pushes up, and it pushes all the seawater out of the edge of the whale's mouth. The krill, the tiny shrimps, the tiny fish are left there, and they take a big gulp of all the krill and the fish. And they will do that over and over and over again. And they'll be feeding for about 18 hours a day, non-stop. Keep going down, taking a big gulp, and feeding on the krill and the fish. Now, it's kind of interesting. The krill, the phytoplankton take in the energy from the sun. They're taking in carbon. So they're sort of taking the carbon out of the atmosphere to form the phytoplankton. That's going into the fish. The whales are eating that. So the whales themselves are becoming big carbon sinks, we call it, where they're taking in the carbon into their bodies. And this probably isn't too nice to think about when we see the whales, but when the whales die, they drop down to the very bottoms of the ocean, and they feed the ecosystems at the bottoms of the ocean. So just by doing this, the whales are actually helping our planet, because they're taking the carbon out of the air, and then they're taking that down to the bottom of the ocean. So if we had more whales, they could be taking more carbon out of the air, and that would kind of benefit all of us. So that's one good thing that they do. Also, when the whales dive down deep, when they come up to the surface, they poo. We seem to be talking a lot about, when we had the people on board from Port Lockroy, I think they were talking about the poo and the penguins. So I think scientists can get a bit obsessed with this. But the whales will poo on the surface, and that feeds all the ecosystems in the ocean. And they kind of bring these nutrients into the ocean. So we also call the whales the ocean gardeners, because they're taking care of everything else by their feeding and diving and providing nutrients for everything. So they're these kind of nutrient pumps, they're carbon sinks, they're gardeners, and we also call them ecosystem engineers. So we know that when there's a whale around, the fish do better. So up in Alaska with the salmon fisheries actually do better when there's plenty of whales around, because they're providing these nutrients, they're cycling everything around. So they are a big part of our oceans, and we kind of know that there's so few of them left after all the whaling days. And we know that if, the more whales there are, the better they will look after the ocean. So they're kind of important for the whole picture. Okay, not quite sure what's going on there. Probably spent too long on that one. Let me just see if I can get that to work. There we go. Okay, so that's kind of all the stuff we know about whales and some of the things we think about whales. And this is a terrible map, so I apologise about this. It's slightly out of focus, but this is the whale migration of the humpback whales, which I think we've talked about before, but we'll just have a little look at it, because you can see we visited this area of Antarctica down on the bottom, down here, which this isn't working either, having a bit of technical nightmare at the moment. But down here, if I walk along here, just down here, I feel like I should be doing a dance and singing, but that's where we visited. So that's the tip of the Antarctic. And you can see that there are whales migrating backwards and forwards to there. And you can see that all the way around Antarctica, the whale populations migrate from the warmer seas and down to the cold, icy seas. So this is something that all the whales are doing constantly, and we're just beginning to find out about this. We used to think that the blubber was there to keep them warm in the icy seas, but we know that that blubber is there for the migration, so that they need to feed for 6 months of the year and then starve for 6 months of the year on average. So they will go up to the warm seas to mate and reproduce, which is very sensible. You wouldn't want to be doing all that down in the Antarctic. So they go to the warm seas to mate and reproduce and to keep their babies safe. So it's all about protecting the next generation, particularly from the orca. The orcas will be the predators for the baby whales, so they're trying to keep the whales safe up in the warmer waters, and then they come down to the cold, icy seas where there's a huge amount of food, and they gorge themselves on the food in the Antarctic or up in Alaska or up in the Arctic. So that's how the humpbacks are constantly moving backwards and forwards. The same as Australia, they come from the other side of Antarctica on the barrier reef on one side, and the Kimberley coast on the west side of Australia. So you can see all the way around the world, these humpback whales are making these incredible migrations. And they migrate every year. It's the longest migration of any mammal. And they may not feed at all for about 8 months. I mean, imagine that, not having anything to eat for 8 whole months. They're living off their layers of blubber, off their layers of fat. I don't think I could go 8 minutes on this cruise ship. So they're doing quite an extraordinary life. They gorge on the krill and on the fish to build up their reserves. And then they return back to the places where they breed again. So it's a constant migration backwards and forwards from the warm water to the cold water. And in the last 20 years, certainly for me, doing this voyage backwards and forwards, I've definitely seen increase in the number of humpback whales in Antarctica, which is fantastic. At the moment, there's a problem with the krill because they rely on that krill. There's a lot of industrial krill fishing going on. There's problems with getting tangled up in the fishing nets in some areas, but certainly in the Antarctic there's a problem with the big krill fishery because that's the same food that they rely on as well. Also with ocean heat waves, especially up in the Pacific, there's been times when the ocean has warmed so much, so quickly, that the food, the krill, kind of turns into more like popcorn. It doesn't have any nutrients in it. So although the whales are feeding, the food has lost its nutritional value. So we have times when they won't be having babies, when the whales are much, much thinner. So even though the numbers are increasing after whaling, there are still plenty of problems for the humpbacks, and they kind of still need our help to keep their populations rising. And these are the babies. So this is quite an unusual photo. This is almost a newborn humpback whale, and he's breaching out of the water in the warmer waters. This is up in Hawaii. So he's about 10 to 12 feet long, about 2,000 pounds, and they stay very close to their mums all the time. There's nothing for them to eat up there in the warmer waters, so they rely on their mum for the milk. And they're up there mainly to avoid the killer whales, mainly to avoid the orcas. And as they get bigger, you'll see that they'll do more breaching. They're leaping out of the water, increasing their ability to dive, increasing their myoglobin levels so that they can breathe underwater. And also up here in the warmer waters, it's a big social occasion. So this is where all the male humpback whales are up there, and they're singing their hearts out. The male humpback whales are the crooners of the ocean. They sing these incredible songs that may last about 10 minutes long, and they repeat the same phrases. Each year they add phrases to the song that they sing. They pass on that song to the other whales, and the other whales can learn the singing. The whales have got a kind of specially adapted voice box so that they can sing underwater. And here they are. This is the mother and the baby at the end of the summer. Once all that socialisation has gone on, all the young males, or the mums, the babies, all the mating, all the breeding, all that goes on up there in the warm waters. And then when the baby is big enough and strong enough at the end of the season, they'll head towards where the food is. So that by that time the mother will be absolutely starving, wouldn't have eaten for about 6 months at least. And when the baby's big enough, they will head to where the cold water is to the feeding. And the mum keeps the baby either at eye level so that she can keep checking on where the baby is, or the baby will be pushed up on her back so that the baby can rest as they're migrating. So the humpback whales are very much the mothers and the babies, and then the males will be off on their own. They don't stay together in a family. When they get back together on the breeding grounds, they all get back together. But the rest of the time, they're very much as individuals who get together to feed, like in bubble net feeding, or when it's better for them to be together. But they don't stay together as a family, just the mothers and the babies will be migrating. And it's kind of like a conveyor belt. They don't all go at the same time. They'll go at different times when the baby's big enough to travel. And once they get to Antarctica, they will be feeding gorging on the krill and the small fish for about 18 hours a day. So that is what we saw when we went down there. And as I said, these are baleen whales. They use sounds to communicate, and they have these huge songs that the males sing. And we don't know all that much about them at the moment. It could possibly be that AI will help us to decipher what it is they're saying to each other. We know that the songs can travel from one side of an ocean to the other side of an ocean, which is extraordinary. The sound doesn't spread out. The ocean is in different layers of density and temperatures, so they will find a certain layer of water and they send the sound waves along that layer of water. So they can only do it at a certain frequency, and it's almost like a telephone cable, like a pipe, that the sound travels along in the layer of the ocean. So from one side of an ocean to the other, they can communicate. And the songs last about 10 minutes, and they evolve and they teach each other bits of these songs. So quite incredible, but we still don't know what these songs really mean. We think it could be that they're conveying some kind of a feeling. So more like music, more like that things are good, or, maybe it's not so good this year, but we don't really understand. But they're certainly conveying something between the populations. And it is only the males that sing. We call it, the song is something called cultural transmission. So this means that they're quite intelligent creatures because they can learn bits of the songs. Not like my dog. I think my dog's quite clever, but he wouldn't be able to hear another dog barking and then remember what that dog did and then repeat it and repeat that to another dog. So dogs don't kind of transmit language and they don't communicate, whereas the whales do. So they're definitely more intelligent than my dog, that's for sure. It's not really saying a lot, to be completely honest. And so we're still learning so much about these whales. There's still so much that we don't know about them. We know they're a really important part of the ocean ecology. We know they have these songs that sing. There's one piece of research which I think is incredible, where when the whales are singing, you get the bioluminescent algae. So if you've ever seen in the ocean where the algae lights up and the ocean will light up, and if the whales are singing close to where the bioluminescent algae is, that algae lights up in the same tune as the whale song, which I think is pretty amazing. So there's a lot we don't know about them. Now, I think we're probably a bit fed up with looking at whales, so put a picture of a couple of kittens there, which is we've looked at a lot of pictures of whales this morning. So just to kind of finish off, everybody always asks, do whales sleep? The answer is yes, they do. They can't sleep like we do because they're mammals that live underwater, so they have to be conscious breathers. They have to be conscious and awake to breathe. So if they fall fast asleep, they would drown, the same as we would in the water. So they take little micro naps, little short naps where they close down bits of their brain and rest. But they don't sleep quite how we do. They sometimes sleep on the surface. They log on the surface, which is a bit dangerous for shipping, or they can hang vertically in the water and sleep. So they do sleep a little bit like the albatross as well, where they just shut down bits of their brain and they won't have a long sleep like we do. So they do micro napping, which I think is quite a lovely thing. And then very quickly we can look at the relationship that we have had with the whales over the years. So this is a Neolithic cave drawing. This comes from South Korea. So we're going back thousands and thousands of years. We think this is evidence of people in a boat harpooning a whale. So you could interpret it in a different way, but we think that's what that is. So that shows our very earliest relationships with the whales. And then in the 18th and 19th century, we used the small boats. The whale oil came along before we had coal and before we had fossil fuels, and we used the oil from the whales, from the blubber, to fuel everything. So the whole of the Industrial Revolution, all our street lighting, anything that we use plastic for today, we used the baleen and the whalebone for in the olden days. So we had these long periods of whaling where we had the small boats, the handheld harpoons. Almost all the major cities around the world were based on whaling ports. So pretty much everywhere came from the whaling days. We started up in the Arctic. When we wiped out all the whales in the Arctic, we came down to the Antarctic and did the same in the Antarctic. So this is what most of the docks would have looked like, with barrels and barrels and barrels of whale oil that comes from the blubber layer of the whales. And then we developed these things, these exploding harpoons that were invented in the late 1800s, and these steam-powered whale catchers. And this kind of spelt the end for the whales, because they couldn't catch the fast whales. Suddenly they could catch all the whales. And we pretty much wiped out every single whale that we could possibly get our hands on, including the blue whales, the fin whales that were very fast. So we could finally kind of catch all those whales, and the whale populations were on the verge of extinction. And this is kind of what I remember from growing up in the 1970s, when we sort of changed our perception of whales. So from being fish that were there for us to exploit, we used to call it the whale fish industry, suddenly the whales became something that we wanted to protect. In the early 1800s, the whalers described areas of the Antarctic as ponds where you could walk from one side of the bay to the other across the backs of the whales. So we went to Admiralty Bay on King George Island, and that would have been one of these whale ponds where it had been packed full of whales, which is quite extraordinary to kind of think about. And there's DNA evidence to show that the whale populations were enormous. So just think, when you're out on deck and you're looking out across the sea thinking, why aren't there any whales? That's kind of the reason, that they're just coming back from the brink of extinction. But at one time, you would have looked out and there would have been whale blows, like everywhere you would have seen for as far as the eye could see. And here they are then, just to finish off very quickly. This is the whole order of whales. These are the air-breathing marine mammals. Here's a little diver down here, just to give some scale, all the grumpy old whales. And all the whales have adapted to live in the water all the time. They don't need to come on land, so they have their babies in the water. And we have the toothed whales. So we talked about the baleen whales. These are the toothed whales, the sperm whales, the dolphins, the porpoises. These are the ones that we'll see in the Falkland Islands, the Commerson's dolphins, the Peel's porpoises. These are the toothed whales that go from the tiniest porpoise up to the orcas, the killer whales. And the orcas are the world's largest dolphins. These are about 30 feet long. They weren't really affected by the whaling because they're very fast. They didn't have such big reserves of blubber. And these live in big family groups, big matriarchal family groups with like the grandmother in charge, teaching the whales what to do. So again, these are highly intelligent social creatures with a language. They all share the same traits, so they're long-lived, they're organised, culturally distinct, so they'll have their own dialect. You can identify an orca by the way its language, its dialect. And if you see an orca with a huge dorsal fin that's about 6 foot tall, then that would be a male orca, so you can see the difference between the males and the females. The males will go off and mate with females from other pods, but then they come back to their family. So they stay with their mums their whole lives and stay with their family, and they help to bring up the young orcas. And they communicate differently to the baleen whales. They use echolocation to detect where their prey is. You can try it yourself. You can sort of like put your fingers in your ears and you can sort of force the air through the back of your mouth, and that makes kind of a clicking noise that the orcas have evolved to send off, identify where their prey is, and then they hear it when it comes back again. And the ones in the Antarctic have developed this incredible hunting where they'll make a bow wave and they actually knock the seals off the icebergs. So they'll do spire hopping around the icebergs and then they'll knock them off. So they're so intelligent, profoundly intelligent social creatures to be able to learn things and pass things through the generations. And just to finish off then, if this works, I'm not sure whether it will or not, but we can hear the orcas language. So this is the this is using echolocation, where they're identifying where their prey is, but also they're communicating with each other. And this is different to the baleen whales. The baleen whales sing and they kind of convey this feeling through more like a music, whereas the orcas is more like a distinct language. And I think that if artificial intelligence is going to help us, then we probably would be able to work out what the orcas are saying to each other, which would be quite incredible. It's probably something like, oh, there's some fish over there, or oh, that was a tasty fish. It's probably going to be very simple, but it would still be lovely to try and work out what the language is. So if this works, just to finish off, we should be able to hear this orca actually singing, possibly. I don't know about technology, I'm not sure if it is going to work or not. Yes, perfect. Lovely. So you just get a feel, that's what's going on under the waves, that's what you can hear. And it'd be great if you can work out what we're actually saying. So just to leave you then, this is from the native Northwest knowledge, so the Tlingit people up on the Pacific Northwest, up in Alaska, and they live very closely with the orcas, and they actually have an orca clan in their families, so they must have lived for thousands of years understanding the orcas. And they tell us that the whales provide us with a message of family, unity and collective strength, which I think is wonderful. Thank you so much for listening today. Enjoy the rest of your day.